Hey, what's going on, guys? It's me, Jay. Here to talk about a funny incident that happened yesterday, and that is the freak accident that hit the Nottoway Plantation in Iberville, Louisiana, the county of White Castle, Louisiana. This was a historic site, the largest plantation in the South. Couple acres, about 3 or 4 acres. Hey, what's going on, Lisa? And it was a historic site. It'd been a historic site since 1985. Let's talk about some of the history. It was built in 1859. It is of Greek, Greco revivalist and Italianate architecture. And the owner, the original owner uh, that commissioned it was John Hamden Randolph. He commissioned the construction of it in, like I said, 1859. And it was a sugar plantation. A little bit about John Hamden Randolph. He was born in 1813 to a his father was a judge in Woodsville, Mississippi. His father was appointed a federal judge out of Woodsville, Mississippi in 1820 by President James Monroe. Like I said, he started in Virginia. That's where the plantation gets its name from. Here was his hometown, Nottoway County, Virginia. From there, he moved with his family in the mid 19th century to Louisiana. And unlike other planters, other planters focused specifically on cotton. He focused instead on sugar growth and, and cultivation, which he perceived to be way more lucrative than cotton. Because I guess everybody was doing cotton. Cotton was king in the late 19th century. So he figured, hey, I'd try something different. A lot of the West Indian markets were drying up, as it were, for sugar plantation because by that time, 1859, uh, most of the West Indian countries, slavery had already been abolished in the West Indies in the 1830s. Brazil was still a competitor, but they produced a lot of other crops. Um, Haiti and the Dominican Republic was already independent by then. Yes, Lisa's right. It's 53 square feet of a plantation. So he knew exactly what he was doing. But unfortunately, it wouldn't last long for him because after he completed it in 1859, the war broke out in 1860, the attack on Fort Sumter um, by Confederate troops, which triggered first the election of Abraham Lincoln and then the attack on Fort Sumter, which triggered the Civil War for the next 5 years. While this was going on, he and several of his slaves escaped to neighboring Texas in hopes that when he came back, his plantation would be safe. The plantation, surprisingly, didn't really suffer much. Only like one little gunshot wound got in the infrastructure during the fight. During the fighting, and his son uh, actually fought in the Battle of Vicksburg in Mississippi in 1863. So he was heavily engaged. Now, after the war, he didn't last very long. He died like within a couple of years after the war. His wife sold the plantation um, to a to a French Creole family, and of course, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, was ratified, and Lisa already got to what I was just about to say. Despite the despite the passage of the 13th Amendment and his passing away, many former slaves, newly freedmen, stayed on. Because what many people don't understand is that these individuals, these former slaves, they didn't really know anything else. You know, they knew domestic work and they knew agricultural work. That was their expertise. It wasn't like they were going to be emancipated, um, right then and there and go, spread out and live their lives. They were pretty much their skill set revolved around agricultural work and domestic work. So in the decades following the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, many of them stayed on. And when it came to John Randolph's slaves, you know, they stayed on as well as low paid workers, mostly indentured laborers, and sharecroppers. What sharecropping was they would own a piece of land and they would work that land, and then they would have to basically pay rent to the plantation owner for being able to work that land in a form of subsistence farming. You know, they were just barely getting by because, again, this was all the skills that they knew. They didn't know anything else. You know what I mean? So it's not like they'll be emancipated and go out in the world and become successful billionaires. They just didn't have the infrastructure for that. So they stood on after the Civil War. Like I said, his wife, Emily Randolph, sold the plantation in 1889 for $50,000, which she divided among 9 surviving children and herself. She died in Baton Rouge in 1904. Yes, he had 11 children. Lisa's correct. I just said that. 11 children. Um, the new owners were Desiree Pierre Landry and her father-in-law Jean-Baptiste Dugas, whose family owned the plantation until 1909, when Landry's widow sold Nottoway to a sugar plantation, Alphonse Holland. Soon after, Holland lost Nottoway to foreclosure in 1913 due to crop failure. The previous 2 years that resulted in tax problems and incurred medical bills by his wife's failing health. Dr. White G. Owen purchased the plantation for $10,000 in 1913. And Dr. Owen was the Surgeon General of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Then after that, finally, Paul Ramsey, an Australian healthcare billionaire, purchased from Sydney, Australia, purchased the property in 1985. But many people died on this plantation. Like most of the owners died. He died in 2014, and it was under his tenure. This was Paul Ramsey. He died in 2014, but under his tenure from 1985 to 2014, that's when this was turned into a National Register site by 1980. It became a popular tourist attraction for many people in the area of southern Louisiana. So that's the history of it. And yesterday it burned down. Partially. It's partially burnt. Like Lisa said, it's 53,000 acres, so it wasn't all burnt, but it was pretty badly burnt. The South is pretty weird because living in the North, um, we don't encounter history in the same way that they do in the South. In the South, it's not so much history as it is a living experience. You know, you have people, you pass by these plantations like Nottoway, and you can see them, you can experience them. They're living memories. They're not, it's not something you read about in a textbook. That is not the case in the North because we didn't have that to a large extent because climate did not permit. We did have slavery that lasted until the early part of the 19th century in New York, but it really wasn't large scale plantation slavery in the way that it was in the South. It was more so domestic slavery, some small farms, but pretty much in the decades after the American Revolution in 1783, from that point on, slavery kind of faded away in the North. So we didn't experience that in the same way. We don't, yeah, we have the African burial ground that Lisa and I went to, but for many years they didn't know that existed. Lisa, remember, we learned about it that it was underground. So and it doesn't. We're not smacked with it in the same way that um, people in the southern states are, especially Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi, what they call the Deep South. These uh, these areas were deep Confederate territory. Louisiana, as a matter of fact, as a territory, had slavery before even any of the English um, speaking territories because they had slavery under French rule as well. The French were the first. I know, I know. The French were the first to experience, I mean, to import uh, African slaves into what they call the Louisiana territory. Some of the comments online, a lot of the comments are happy online, especially regarding, especially for Black Americans. Many are saying there was Annabella from um, the movie Sinners, memes with Left Eye, memes with Angela Bassett. But among the white population, there is an effort to minimize slavery, bring back some of those lost cause myths. What is the lost cause myth? Go into a little of that. The lost cause myth is a belief that slavery wasn't all that bad, and that even though the South lost, they were fighting for a heroic cause, the cause of states' rights. They were fighting for uh, bravery and valor, and that they were honest men just fighting to defend their territory from northern aggression. And going along with that myth is the happy slave myth, the myth that the slaves were happy when they were um, the people were happy that when they were enslaved because they were exposed to civilization. This is the view of white racists, much the same way that they have about white South Africa. That were it not for the Boers settling in South Africa, the Africans, the Black Africans, would have not achieved anything because, according to them, black South Africans and black people are inferior. So they need the white contact and the white patronage and the white um, guidance to become successful. Basically, it's a form of patronizing. They're basically patronizing. They view the black Africans as infantile, as prone to fits of joy, as irresponsible, as too party minded, too feeble minded, too childlike, to uh, to live on their own. So they need the help and they need the guidance of their white overlords. And they look at pictures of, in the South in those days, in the antebellum era, before the Civil War, of black people dancing and, you know, acting joyous. And they say, well, see, that's an example. It couldn't have been all that bad. I mean, hey, they were fed, they were clothed, they were taken care of. But what they fail to realize is that was a front because for their own survival. They had to act like that because if they acted disgruntled and they expressed the way they really felt, then they would be they would be killed, right? You know, so they were being fooled. But this idea is egregious. This is stupid. No man, irrespective of his or her race, is happy being under servitude. If that were the case, why fight the American Revolution? Were the Americans that were under British colonial control, were they happy to be under British colonial control? I mean, hell, Britain was a more advanced society than they were, so they should have been happy to be under British control, happy to be under British guidance. But they didn't look at it right that way, right? They fought against the British. They considered the British as enslaving them. That's the way they framed it. That was the utter hypocrisy of it all, was that these same people, these same Southern planters, like this guy, were talking about freedom and talking about independence and talking about liberty, while at the same time holding other human beings in bondage. I mean, the very man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, was himself a very successful Southern plantation owner. So was George Washington. As a matter of fact, when you look at George Washington's biography, you find out that one of the reasons why he was so anti-British or became so anti-British was the fact that the British were promising freedom to any black person who remained a loyalist, who remained on the side of the British during the American Revolution, and many black people did. After the war was over, that black population in the 1780s was relocated to Nova Scotia in Canada. Some were relocated to Nova Scotia in Canada. Others were relocated to Sierra Leone in West Africa to have basically a country of their own and to be repatriated to West Africa. So that was the case for many. During the American Revolution, the entirety of mostly, besides the First Rhode Island Battalion, which was made up mostly of free blacks, the vast majority of black people who fought in the American Revolution fought on the side of the British and not the Americans, and understandably so. And likewise, with the American Civil War. With the American Civil War, it wasn't until the middle of the war that the Union decided to conscript black officers in the army, and